They laughed at my ill-fitting uniform, called me a pretender playing dress-up. The senior officers smirked, whispering, I didn't belong. But when the enemy attacked and chaos erupted, those same soldiers who mocked me would soon discover the truth that would change everything and save their lives. If you love stories of justice and unexpected twists that'll blow your mind, smash that like button right now and subscribe, because what happens next will leave you speechless. My name is Rachel Torres, and I've been in the military for 15 years. I've commanded units across 3 different continents, earned my rank through blood, sweat, and countless sleepless nights. But none of that mattered as I stood outside Forward Operating Base Phoenix that morning, staring at the dusty compound that would become the stage for the most important lesson I'd ever teach. The October sun beat down mercilessly on the desert outpost, and I could already hear the sounds of soldiers going about their morning routines. Distant voices carried on the wind, mixed with the metallic clang of equipment being moved and the rumble of vehicles. This was supposed to be a routine inspection and evaluation of the 3rd Battalion, but something had been gnawing at me for weeks. Reports had been filtering up through command about issues with unit cohesion, whispers of discrimination, and concerning incidents that never quite made it into official documentation. I'd made a decision that my superiors would probably call unconventional, maybe even reckless. Instead of arriving in my perfectly pressed uniform with my lieutenant colonel insignia gleaming in the sun, I'd chosen a different approach. In my duffel bag, I carried an oversized uniform I'd borrowed from the base laundry, deliberately selecting one that was too big, slightly faded, and missing the crisp creases that marked an experienced soldier. I wanted to see what happened when I stripped away every symbol of authority and rank. Standing in that small supply closet, I methodically removed my insignia, my ribbons, every piece of metal and fabric that told the story of my career. Each pin that came off felt like shedding skin, revealing something raw and vulnerable underneath. I messed up my hair, scuffed my boots against the concrete floor, and practiced looking uncertain in the cracked mirror hanging on the wall. The reflection staring back at me looked like a nervous recruit on her first day, not a seasoned officer who'd led troops through some of the most challenging operations the military had seen. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was about to deceive the very people I was meant to lead, but sometimes leadership requires uncomfortable choices. I'd learned long ago that people's true character emerges not when they're being watched by authority, but when they think no one important is looking. I needed to know who these soldiers really were when they thought the coast was clear. As I adjusted the ill-fitting uniform one final time, my hands trembling slightly with a mixture of anticipation and dread, I wondered what I was about to discover. Would these be the kind of soldiers I could trust with my life, with the lives of others? Or would I uncover something darker, something that would require me to make decisions that could destroy careers and shatter the carefully constructed hierarchy of military life? I took a deep breath, shouldered my pack, and stepped out into the blazing desert sun. The next few hours would reveal everything I needed to know about the character of every person on this base, including myself. I just had no idea how high the stakes would become, or how quickly a simple test of character would transform into a life-or-death situation where every assumption would be shattered and every judgment would be put to the ultimate test. The game was about to begin, and I was walking into it completely blind to the consequences. The mess hall buzzed with the familiar sounds of soldiers grabbing breakfast before the day's training began. I hesitated at the entrance, my oversized uniform hanging awkwardly on my frame, and scanned the room full of men and women I was supposed to command. They had no idea who I was, and for the first time in years I felt genuinely nervous. I approached a table where 3 soldiers were hunched over their coffee and eggs. Staff Sergeant Jake Morrison looked up first, his weathered face breaking into a smirk that immediately set my teeth on edge. Next to him sat Corporal Lisa Chen, whose sharp eyes took in every detail of my appearance with the precision of someone trained to spot weaknesses. The third soldier, Private Martinez, simply stared. "Well, well," Jake drawled, leaning back in his chair like he'd just discovered the day's entertainment. "Look what the Army sent us." "Did you raid the lost and found, sweetheart?" His voice carried just loud enough for nearby tables to hear, and I watched heads turn in our direction. The laughter started as a ripple and spread through the immediate area like wildfire. I forced myself to stumble slightly as I set down my tray, playing into their expectations. "I'm sorry, I'm new here." Still getting used to everything. My voice came out smaller than intended, which only seemed to encourage them. Lisa's laugh was sharp as broken glass. "New? Honey, you look like you've never worn a uniform in your life. Did they even teach you how to fold your clothes in basic training?" She gestured at my ill-fitting jacket, and more soldiers began gathering around, drawn by the spectacle. The humiliation burned in my chest, but I'd committed to this path. I needed to see how far they would go, how deep their casual cruelty ran. Each snicker, each whispered comment felt like a physical blow, but I forced myself to stand there and take it. "Maybe she's one of those weekend warriors," Martinez chimed in, finally finding his voice. Plays soldier on Saturdays and thinks she's ready for the real thing." The crowd around us grew larger, and I realized this had become the morning's entertainment. Things escalated during equipment check. Jake deliberately assigned me to inventory the heaviest gear, watching with obvious amusement as I struggled with boxes that any properly trained soldier should handle easily. But I wasn't struggling because I couldn't lift them. I was struggling because my heart was breaking with every casual insult, every dismissive gesture from people I'd devoted my career to protecting. "Since you clearly don't know what you're doing," Jake announced loudly, "why don't you handle the cleaning supplies? Might be more your speed." The laughter that followed echoed off the concrete walls, and I felt something cold and hard settle in my stomach. Lisa joined in, her voice dripping with mock concern. "Are you sure you're in the right place? The civilian contractors' quarters are in the next building. Maybe that's where you belong?" Her words hit harder than Jake's crude jokes because they carried the weight of someone who should have known better, should have shown solidarity instead of joining the pack. But it was when Major Tom Bradley arrived that my world truly tilted off its axis. As my second-in-command, he was someone I'd handpicked for his leadership potential, someone I'd trusted with sensitive operations. I watched him approach the crowd, expecting him to disperse the gathering and restore order. Instead, he laughed. "What's all the commotion?" Bradley asked, and when Jake explained about the new girl who doesn't know which end is up, Bradley's face lit up with cruel amusement. "Well, I can see why. Look at her." His voice boomed across the area, and I felt every eye in the vicinity turn toward me. "You're a disgrace to this uniform. How did you even make it through basic training?" The shouting started then, Bradley's voice rising as he warmed to his theme. "You don't deserve to wear the same uniform as these real soldiers. You're an embarrassment to everything this military stands for." His words came like hammer blows, each one driving deeper than the last, because this wasn't just another soldier joining the mob. This was my own officer, someone whose career I'd personally advanced. I stood there in that circle of mockery, surrounded by people whose lives I held in my hands, whose futures depended on my decisions, and felt the crushing weight of their rejection. They didn't just disrespect the uniform, they were attacking everything I'd built my life around, everything I'd sacrificed for. The betrayal cut deeper than any enemy bullet ever could. That night, alone in my quarters, I questioned everything. Maybe I was wrong to test them. Maybe this reflected some failure in my own leadership. But as I sat there in the darkness, listening to the sounds of the bass settling into night, I knew the real test was just beginning. The alarm that shattered the pre-dawn quiet wasn't the usual drill signal. This was the harsh, urgent wail that meant real trouble, the sound that made your blood freeze and your training kick in simultaneously. I jolted awake, my body already moving before my mind fully processed what was happening. "All personnel to emergency stations! This is not a drill! Repeat, this is not a drill!" The voice crackling through the base communication system belonged to Colonel Peters, but something was wrong. The transmission cut off mid-sentence, replaced by static that made my skin crawl. I threw on my oversized uniform and rushed outside, where chaos was already taking hold. What should have been a coordinated response looked more like a disturbed anthill. Soldiers ran in different directions, some toward their posts, others seeming to flee from shadows only they could see. In the distance, I could hear gunfire, real gunfire, not the controlled bursts of training exercises. The communications tower was dark. Emergency lights flickered sporadically, casting eerie shadows across the compound. Through the confusion, I caught fragments of panicked conversations. "Perimeter breach in Sector 7. Where's the colonel? Communications are down. They're inside the wire." My heart sank as the reality hit me. What was supposed to be a routine training exercise had somehow become a genuine security crisis. The simulated enemy forces that were scheduled to test our defenses had either gone rogue or been replaced by actual hostile elements. In the darkness and confusion, it was impossible to tell friend from foe. I watched Jake Morrison stumble past, his earlier swagger replaced by barely controlled panic. "Where's Major Bradley?" he shouted at no one in particular. "What are our orders?" But Bradley was nowhere to be seen, and Colonel Peters, the base's actual commanding officer, was at headquarters 30 miles away, completely cut off from us by the communications blackout. Lisa Chen appeared beside me, her face pale in the flickering emergency lights. For a moment, I saw her recognize me, the woman she'd humiliated just hours earlier, but the crisis had stripped away her earlier cruelty. "Do you know what's happening?" she asked, her voice small and desperate. The transformation was jarring. This was the same person who'd questioned whether I belonged in uniform, now looking to me for answers. The sound of explosions rumbled from the eastern perimeter, and I realized the situation was deteriorating rapidly. Whoever was attacking us knew exactly where to hit. The ammunition depot, our most vulnerable target, was under direct threat. If they reached it, the entire base could be destroyed in a single devastating blast. That's when I saw Major Bradley emerge from the command bunker, and my blood turned to ice. The man I'd trusted with critical operations, who'd screamed at me about being a disgrace to the uniform, was completely falling apart under real pressure. His hands shook as he tried to coordinate a response, his voice cracking as he issued contradictory orders that only added to the confusion. "Fall back to secondary positions," he shouted, then immediately countermanded himself. "No, wait! Advance to the perimeter." Soldiers looked at each other with growing alarm, realizing their acting commander had no idea what he was doing. The tactical errors he was making weren't just embarrassing, they were going to get people killed. I watched Marines and soldiers I'd sworn to protect scatter like leaves in a hurricane, some following Bradley's confused orders, others simply trying to survive. The base's carefully planned defense protocols had collapsed into deadly chaos. Men and women who'd mocked me hours earlier now ran past with terror in their eyes, completely leaderless in the face of genuine danger. From my position near the motor pool, I could see the full scope of the disaster unfolding. Enemy forces, and I still couldn't tell who they were or what they wanted, had penetrated multiple sections of our defense perimeter. Without proper coordination, our superior numbers and firepower meant nothing. We were being systematically picked apart by what appeared to be a much smaller but infinitely better organized force. The bitter irony wasn't lost on me. These soldiers who'd questioned my competence based on an ill-fitting uniform were now paying the price for following leaders who looked the part but couldn't perform when it mattered. Lives hung in the balance, and the only person on this base with the experience and authority to save them was the same woman they'd spent yesterday treating like garbage. I had a choice to make, and I had to make it now. The moment of truth arrived like lightning splitting the darkness. I couldn't stand there any longer, watching good soldiers die because of failed leadership and my own wounded pride. These people had hurt me, humiliated me, questioned my very right to exist in their world. But they were still my responsibility. They were still mine to protect. I stepped into the chaos, and everything inside me shifted. The uncertain, bumbling recruit they'd mocked disappeared, replaced by 15 years of hard-earned authority. My voice cut through the panic like a blade through silk, carrying across the compound with the unmistakable ring of absolute command. "This is Lieutenant Colonel Rachel Torres, taking immediate command of this base." The effect was instantaneous and devastating. Jake Morrison, who'd been running toward what would have been certain death, stopped so abruptly he nearly fell over. His face went through a series of expressions: confusion, disbelief, then dawning horror as the full implications hit him. The woman he'd called sweetheart and told to handle cleaning supplies was a lieutenant colonel. Lisa Chen's weapon actually slipped from her hands, clattering onto the concrete as she stared at me with her mouth hanging open. The sharp-tongued woman who'd suggested I belonged with civilian contractors was looking at someone who outranked nearly everyone on the base. I watched the blood drain from her face as she realized the magnitude of what she'd done, but it was Major Bradley's reaction that satisfied something dark and hungry in my chest. My second in command, the man who'd screamed that I was a disgrace to the uniform, went rigid with shock. He tried to salute, his hand shaking so badly he could barely complete the gesture. "Ma'am, I didn't... Colonel, I can explain?" His voice broke like a teenager's, all his earlier bluster evaporating into pathetic stammering. "Explanation later, Major. Right now, we have a base to save." My words were ice cold, and I saw him flinch as if I'd struck him. The same voice that had humiliated me was now reduced to terrified whispers. I moved through the base like a force of nature, issuing rapid-fire orders that transformed chaos into coordinated action. The soldiers who'd questioned my competence now hung on every word, desperate to follow someone who actually knew what they were doing. There was bitter poetry in watching Jake Morrison, who'd assigned me to inventory duty, now depend on my tactical decisions to survive. "Chen, take your squad and secure the eastern perimeter. Morrison, coordinate with communications to re-establish contact with headquarters. Bradley, you'll oversee ammunition depot security from the rear position." Each order was precise, professional, and carried the subtle sting of perfect reversal. The people who'd relegated me to menial tasks were now following my commands to stay alive. The enemy forces, whoever they were, had counted on our disorganization. They hadn't planned for coordinated resistance from a properly led defense. Within minutes of taking command, I'd turned their methodical assault into a desperate retreat. Our superior numbers and firepower, properly directed, overwhelmed their tactical advantage. I watched Jake carry out his orders with grim efficiency, the same hands that had mocked my struggle with equipment boxes now working desperately to implement my strategic plans. Lisa Chen, who'd questioned whether I belonged in uniform, now executed my perimeter defense with the precision of someone whose life depended on my competence, which it did. The sweetest revenge came not from anger or cruelty, but from simple, undeniable competence. Every successful tactical decision was proof of what they'd failed to see. Every life saved was evidence of their massive error in judgment. They judged me by my appearance, and nearly paid for it with their lives. As the last of the enemy forces retreated, and the all-clear signal finally sounded, an eerie quiet settled over the base. The crisis was over, but the reckoning was just beginning. In the harsh light of emergency flares, I stood before the soldiers who'd spent the previous day destroying my dignity, and I saw something in their eyes that hadn't been there before: genuine fear. Not fear of the enemy forces we'd just repelled, but fear of me. Fear of the consequences of their actions. Fear of what happens when you humiliate the very person whose job it is to keep you alive. They were about to learn that lesson in full. In the aftermath, as dawn broke over Forward Operating Base Phoenix, I gathered the soldiers who had participated in my humiliation. They stood before me in the same courtyard where they'd laughed at my uniform, but the laughter was long gone. What remained was the heavy weight of consequence and the bitter taste of their own judgment. Major Bradley could barely meet my eyes. This man who'd screamed that I was a disgrace to the uniform now stood at attention, knowing his career hung by a thread. "Ma'am," he began, his voice barely above a whisper, "I owe you an apology that I'll never be able to make adequately." I let the silence stretch between us, watching him squirm under the weight of his own actions. "You're right, Major. You can't apologize adequately, because what you did wasn't just about me, it was about every soldier you're supposed to protect. A true leader defends everyone under their command, regardless of how they look or where they come from." Jake Morrison stepped forward, his usual swagger replaced by genuine remorse. "Colonel, we had no idea. We were wrong, completely wrong. The man who'd assigned me to cleaning supplies was now pleading for understanding from the woman whose competence had saved his life. That's exactly the problem, Sergeant. You had no idea, but you acted anyway. You made assumptions based on appearance rather than giving someone the chance to prove their worth." I studied each face in turn, seeing the full spectrum of human reaction to being fundamentally wrong about someone who mattered. Lisa Chen, who'd suggested I belonged with civilian contractors, spoke with tears in her eyes. "We failed you, ma'am. We failed as soldiers and as human beings. How do we make this right? Some mistakes can be fixed with apologies and second chances. Others reveal character flaws too deep to ignore. Over the following days, I made the hardest decisions of my command career. Soldiers who showed genuine remorse and growth, like Chen and Morrison, earned the opportunity to prove themselves under proper leadership. They would serve under close supervision, their actions monitored, their commitment tested daily. But Major Bradley, my former second-in-command who'd led the charge in my humiliation, received transfer orders. Leadership isn't just about tactical competence, it's about character, integrity, and the wisdom to see potential in others. He'd failed that test spectacularly, and some failures can't be overlooked. Months later, Forward Operating Base Phoenix became one of the most cohesive units in the entire theater. The soldiers who'd learned to look beyond appearances became fierce advocates for inclusive leadership. They'd learned the hardest lesson any military unit can learn, that true strength comes from unity, not uniformity. As I stood in that same courtyard where my test began, watching soldiers who now worked together regardless of background or appearance, I reflected on the price of the lesson we'd all learned. They saw a woman in an ill-fitting uniform and assumed incompetence. They discovered that day that true authority comes from within, that respect must be given before it can be received, and that the person you underestimate might be the very one holding your life in their hands. Sometimes the best leaders are the ones you least expect, wearing uniforms that don't quite fit, waiting for the moment when character matters more than appearance. If this story of justice and redemption gave you chills, hit that like button and subscribe for more incredible stories of people who proved their worth when it mattered most. Comment below, what would you have done in Rachel's situation? See you in the next one.